Kansas has a bit of a mixed record on race relations. Of course, you probably all know that Kansas has this reputation as the free state, which goes back to the 1850s. During the territorial period, this was a site where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were duking it out as to whether Kansas would come into the Union eventually as a free state or a slave state. So as Jay was mentioning earlier, places like Lawrence and Topeka were started primarily by abolitionists for the express purpose of bringing Kansas in as a free state. So it's during that time in the 1850s where Kansas gets this reputation because of people like John Brown as a place that is safe, welcoming for African Americans. If you go to Lawrence, Free State Brewery, they built a whole mythos around this notion. Part of the reason for that is what inspires a movement by African Americans in the 1870s to come here. 1878, 79, you've got a movement of 26,000 blacks out of the South coming to Kansas expressly because of this reputation as a sanctuary away from racism. Well, that's the positive side. On the negative side, Kansas hasn't always lived up to that reputation. Something that we're discovering about the Free State movement is that, yes, it was anti-slavery, but it wasn't exactly pro-black. In 1860, when the Wyandotte Constitution was written in Wyandotte County, one of the goals there was to bring Kansas in, yes, as a free state, but there was also a provision in that document to exclude free black people from living here. So just because you were abolitionist, just because you were anti-slavery, didn't necessarily mean you wanted blacks and whites living here side by side. Kansas reluctantly supported the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to black men. And the Exodus movement that I mentioned earlier in the late 1870s, partly as a consequence of 26,000 refugees from the South arriving here, is that Kansas established its first segregation laws. I'll wait for this truck to pass. Segregation in Kansas was not the way you saw segregation practiced in the South. Kansas had a bit of a decentralized system in that the state government did not legally mandate segregation, but it allowed for local communities to do so at the local level. So you did have segregation practiced in towns like Topeka, Leavenworth, Kansas City, Kansas, which is where most of the black population lived. And you did have segregation that applied in theaters, restaurants, public facilities. Particularly, you saw it applying in school districts. Now, Kansas divided communities into first class and second class. So a second-class city was anything that was above 15,000 people. So that's not coincidentally where about 98% of all African Americans in Kansas lived. We're going to talk a little bit on Wednesday about blacks in western Kansas who lived in small rural communities like Nicodemus. But most of the black population lived here in the northeastern part of the state. So that means that communities like Topeka did allow for segregation to be practiced at the local level. Segregation was practiced in Topeka until 1955. You have a strong black middle class in Topeka and in places like also Lawrence and Kansas City. And by the mid-20th century, there were strong black organizations like the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was particularly strong here in Topeka. While we just came through, in fact, this whole area around the Capitol, right over there, this was the black neighborhood. Now, Topeka was not like a ghetto you'd find in a place like St. Louis or Chicago. This was mostly a middle-class black community. They had their own newspapers, they had their own local doctors, lawyers, so it was a strong, vibrant African-American community. You had black children coming to this place, to Monroe Elementary School, where they were taught by black teachers. Well, one of the myths about the Brown case, and this is something that's perpetuated by the media, is that you've got this little girl named Linda Brown who had to walk far, far away from her home across the dangerous railroad tracks to go to the black school far away from where she lived when there was a perfectly good white school nearby. That's the aura, the reputation associated with the Brown case. Excuse my cell phone going off. Linda Brown was about 11 years old when the case began, and this was not something that was begun spontaneously. Her father, Oliver Brown, was a local minister, but he was also active in the local branch of the NAACP. So this was really a community effort, as were all of these kinds of cases. It was not some spontaneous thing like Rosa Parks refusing to relinquish her seat. All of these were highly orchestrated affairs. As you know, any case that starts at the local level and goes to the United States Supreme Court takes years. So by the time this case actually got to the court in 1954, Linda Brown was in high school. She'd get married a few years later, start having children. So really this was never about her. This was really a test against school desegregation, or against school segregation, I should say. One of the reasons why the case is named Brown is for the name Oliver Brown, but in fact the Brown case that goes to Washington, D.C. is a consolidation of 6 different cases that are mostly located in southern states. It's named Brown partly because Oliver Brown's name was the first alphabetically of all the different plaintiffs. And also, and this is not corroborated by evidence, but I've heard this told to me anecdotally by people locally here who were involved in the case, that they wanted Kansas's name to be on the Supreme Court decision because nobody would expect segregation to happen in a place like Kansas. Nationally, most people were unaware that segregation even existed outside the South, and they certainly didn't think it would exist in a Midwestern state with Kansas's reputation. At any rate, the case goes to the United States Supreme Court. The plaintiff's lawyer is Thurgood Marshall, later goes on to become a Supreme Court justice himself, the first black Supreme Court justice. And what they present at this hearing is very overwhelming. And basically, the Earl Warren Court overrules the earlier decision in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, which did make segregation in public schools legal. I won't go into too much of the details of the case itself. They do that here very well. Something to consider when you're going inside and you're seeing these monuments to the civil rights movement. There were many African Americans in Topeka who weren't too happy with the court's decision, because a few years later the Brown Elementary School would be closed. And in fact, this is what happened to all of the black schools that were affected locally. When Topeka does desegregate its public schools, white and black kids start going to the same classrooms, having the same teachers. Well, what are the white parents going to do? We don't really like our kids being taught by black teachers. Consequently, the black teachers who worked in places like this were eventually terminated, lost their jobs, and it was actually seen as a blow to the black community. Studies show that the black community in Topeka economically is worse off today than it was in 1954. And that's true for a lot of black areas around the country. If you think about it, segregation had its moral problems, but it kept that money, it kept that professional class there in the black community. Well, in the 1960s, as segregation ended and the black doctors, lawyers, newspaper publishers moved out to the suburbs, places like Johnson County, what they left behind them was a group that was much poorer, what sociologists call the underclass.